left the White House on the 19th of November with 6 members of John Kennedy's cabinet to go to Japan. It was an economic conference, but the reason I was going was the president asked me to go to arrange for him a visit he was going to make to Japan in February of 1964. I was always in charge of arranging foreign visits, like coming to Paris and seeing Charles de Gaulle in 61 and so on. And no American president had been in Japan since the end of World War II, so it was going to be a big event. We stopped in Honolulu for 2.5 days for a big conference on Vietnam. We had, of course, in our own group that was on the plane, we had the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, we had the Secretary of the Treasury, McNamara, we had the head of the National Security Council, Mac George Bundy, plus we had brought diplomats and military people from Vietnam to discuss the Vietnam situation. We left Honolulu very early in the morning on the 22nd of November, and we were about 2.5 hours out on the flight when I was suddenly called in. It was a presidential plane, and with the presidential plane there was a private office, and they asked me to come to the private office, and the 6 members of the cabinet were sitting around the table and looked terrible, and they showed me the wire story that they had just gotten, which had said that John Kennedy had been shot. Didn't say he was dead, just shot. They asked me to set up the communication system because we had the presidential communication system and be in contact with the White House and keep in touch with the White House. Meanwhile, the plane turned around, headed back towards Honolulu. And our plan was to land in Honolulu, refuel, and then head for Dallas, where Kennedy had been shot. And it was the White House, when I finally got them on the line, it was very confusing. They didn't quite know what had happened or anything. And we didn't get any specific information for about a half hour. And then suddenly, I hear somebody saying in my ear, "Wayside, stand by." Wayside was my code name. And then every 30 seconds for about 3 minutes, it was always Wayside, stand by. And then suddenly I heard them say, "Wayside, Lancer is dead." Lancer was the code name of John Kennedy. So obviously, we landed in Honolulu, we refueled, we didn't go to Dallas, we headed back to Washington. And we arrived in Washington around 1 o'clock in the morning, Washington time. And it was just at the time that John Kennedy's body was brought into the White House, into the East Room. And there was a religious ceremony there in the East Room. And after it was over, Jackie Kennedy came up to me and said, "You've had a terrible day. Why don't you sleep in the White House tonight?" I'd never slept in the White House in my life. Well, that's not true. I had slept during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in my own room. And so I went upstairs. Excuse me. I went upstairs with 2 of my colleagues, Larry O'Brien and Ken O'Donnell. And we talked until about 5 o'clock in the morning and finally went to bed. And then the most remarkable thing happened. Around 7 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang next to my bed. I picked it up and they said, "The president wants to talk to you." And I had this terrible feeling I had had a nightmare, that a dream had happened during my night. And then I hear the voice of Lyndon Johnson.